There was a time when telling someone you loved them meant sitting alone in your bedroom for 3 hours, pressing record. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The tape deck, the radio, your finger hovering over the record button waiting for the right song to come on. The way you'd rewind and listen back, not to the music, but to the silence between the songs, making sure the transitions felt right, making sure it told the right story. The mixtape. Not a playlist, not an algorithm, not shuffle, a mixtape. Something you made by hand, in real time, with real stakes. Because if you messed up the sequence, you couldn't just drag and drop. You had to start over. And somehow that limitation, that fragile, irreversible, deeply inconvenient limitation, made the whole thing matter in a way that nothing digital has ever quite replicated. This is a video about why. But it's not really about music. It's about identity. It's about the first time most of us figured out who we were by trying to explain ourselves to someone else. It's about what we were actually doing when we thought we were just making a tape for someone we liked. We were building ourselves. A cassette tape is a small plastic rectangle, about the size of a deck of cards. Inside it, 2 spools of magnetic tape, wound tight, holding sound in a way that was always slightly impermanent. Cassettes degraded. They warped in heat. They got chewed by tape decks. The sound quality was never perfect. There was always a little hiss underneath the music, a faint reminder that this was a recording of something, not the thing itself, and that imperfection was part of it. You wrote on the label in pen or marker, sometimes carefully, with your best handwriting, agonizing over whether to underline the title or not. Sometimes with little drawings in the margins, stars, hearts, whatever felt right for the person you were making it for. The physical object carried your handwriting, your decisions, your hesitations. You could see where you'd corrected a misspelling, crossed something out, started again. The tape was evidence of effort in a way that a Spotify link will never be. When someone handed you a mixtape they had made for you, you were holding 3 hours of someone's attention, their time, their thought. The physical weight of it was almost nothing. The emotional weight of it was enormous. Making a mixtape was a ritual, and like all rituals, the process was as meaningful as the result. You started with the songs. Not just any songs, the right songs. Songs that said something you couldn't say directly. Songs that captured a feeling you didn't have words for yet. Songs that, when you heard them, made you think of the person, or of who you wanted to be, or of what you wanted the two of you to become. This was curation before curation was a word anyone used casually. You were editing your own emotional landscape and presenting it to someone else. Here is what I hear when I hear music. Here is what moves me. Here is the inside of my chest, organized into 45 minutes per side. And then there was the sequence. The sequence was everything. You didn't just dump the songs in, you built an arc. The opening song had to be strong enough to make them press play again. The closing song had to leave them with something. A feeling, an image, a question. The middle had to breathe and shift and build. You were writing a narrative. You just didn't know that's what it was called. And then the recording itself. Sitting there with the tape deck and the source, the radio, another tape, the record player, and pressing record and play at the same time, that dual button press that was the physical act of commitment. The song is going on the tape now, this is happening. If the phone rang, you paused. If someone knocked on your door, you paused. You were protective of the space. Because the tape was accumulating something real and it deserved that protection. Here's the psychological reality of what was happening in that bedroom. You were performing identity, not performing in the fake sense, in the deep human sense. The sense that says we become who we are partly through the act of presenting ourselves to others and watching how that presentation lands. Every song you chose for that tape was a statement. I am the kind of person who loves this song. I feel the way this song feels. This lyric. This specific lyric in the bridge of this specific song. This is true about me. And because you were choosing songs for someone else, you were also making a case. You were saying, here is who I am, and I think you might understand it. I think maybe you feel some of this too. I think we might be the same kind of people. The mixtape was an audition for connection, for intimacy, for the terrifying possibility that someone might look at the contents of your inner life and say, yes, I recognize this, I feel this too. For most of us, this was happening in our teenage years. The exact period when the question of who am I was the most urgent, most confusing, most consuming question in the world, when identity was in active construction, when we were desperately sorting through everything, music, clothes, language, friends, beliefs, trying to figure out what belonged to us and what didn't. The mixtape was one of the primary tools of that sorting. Now let's talk about the specific one, the one that everyone who lived through this era made at least once, the tape for the person you liked. This was a different category. This wasn't the tape you made for your best friend to play in the car. This wasn't the tape you made to pump yourself up before something. This was the one that kept you up at night second-guessing every single track. Because the stakes were different. You weren't just showing someone your taste, you were showing someone your heart, and you were doing it with plausible deniability, because they were just songs, right? You could always say it was just music you liked. You could always step back from the ledge if you needed to. Except the songs you chose made the ledge completely obvious to anyone paying attention. There was always one song on the tape that was the real message, the one where you were genuinely saying something you couldn't say out loud, the one where the lyrics were doing work that your voice couldn't do yet, and you put it where? Probably not first. Too exposed, not last, too heavy. Maybe track 3 on side 1, just far enough in that they'd be listening properly by then, close enough to the front that it would hit before the tape ended. You thought about this. You thought about it a lot. And the handwriting on the label, you wrote their name, you probably rewrote it. You held the tape in your hand before you gave it to them and felt the full weight of what it represented. A declaration disguised as a gift, a confession wrapped in song titles, your entire interior life organized into 90 minutes of magnetic tape. Here's something worth understanding about why all of this worked the way it did. Music and memory are linked in a way that nothing else quite matches. When you hear a song that's attached to a strong emotional memory, you don't just remember the memory, you re-experience it. The same neural pathways that were active during the original experience get reactivated. The brain doesn't just retrieve the data, it restores the feeling. This is why hearing a song from your teenage years doesn't just remind you of being 17. It makes you feel 17, for 30 seconds, for the length of the chorus. The specificity is almost violent sometimes. And because the mixtape was created in a moment of heightened emotional intensity, the focused attention, the care, the stakes, the songs on it got bonded to those feelings in a particularly strong way. For the person receiving the tape, those songs became permanently associated with the moment of receiving it, with whoever gave it to them, with who they were at that exact age, in that exact season. And for the person who made it, the songs became permanently associated with the person they made it for. Years later, decades later, you hear track 3 on side 1, and you are immediately, involuntarily, right back in that bedroom, right back to that feeling, right back to being that version of yourself, the one who sat there for 3 hours trying to find the right way to say something they didn't have words for. That's not nostalgia, that's neuroscience. The mixtapes you made, all of them, not just the romantic ones, were an archive, a record of who you were becoming, a document of your evolving taste, your shifting emotional life, your changing sense of what mattered. Each tape was a snapshot. This is what I loved in October of that year. This is what I was listening to when I was figuring that particular thing out. This is the sound of me at 15, at 17, at 19. And because the sequence mattered, because you thought about the narrative, those tapes had a kind of intentionality that random playlists don't. You were making editorial decisions about your own emotional life. You were saying this song belongs with this song because something connects them, even if I can't explain exactly what. That instinct for connection, for finding the through line between things that seem separate, is a creative and intellectual skill, and most of us were practicing it before we had any idea that's what we were doing. The kid sitting in the bedroom making a tape for someone they liked wasn't just being romantic. They were learning to edit, learning to sequence, learning to build a narrative arc, learning to think about what the beginning says versus what the ending says, and what you need in the middle to make the journey feel earned. They were learning to tell stories. I want to be honest about something. I'm not going to tell you that streaming is worse than cassettes. The convenience is real. The access is extraordinary. Having every piece of recorded music ever made available in your pocket is genuinely remarkable. But something was lost. When you make a playlist on a streaming service, the friction is gone. You add, you remove, you reorder with a gesture. Nothing is permanent. Nothing costs anything. And because nothing costs anything, the act of making it doesn't carry the same weight. The limitation was the point. When you had 90 minutes of tape, you had to choose. You couldn't put everything on, you had to edit. You had to decide what mattered enough to make the cut, and those decisions, made under real constraints in real time with no ability to easily revise, those decisions meant something. There's a concept in art and design called the generative constraint. The idea that limitation doesn't just restrict creativity, it produces it. That working within boundaries forces a depth of thought and a specificity of choice that unlimited freedom rarely generates. The 90-minute tape was a generative constraint, and the songs you chose within that constraint were a more honest portrait of who you were than anything unlimited could have produced. Because you couldn't choose everything, you had to choose what mattered most. Here's what I keep coming back to. The mixtape was one of the first times most of us had to answer a question we'd never been asked directly before. What moves you? Not what do you like. What moves you? What reaches into your chest and does something? What, when you hear it, makes you feel less alone in whatever it is you're feeling? And then, harder still, can you share it? Can you offer that part of yourself to someone else and trust them to receive it? Can you be that specific about your inner life and survive the vulnerability of having been that specific? That's not a small thing. That's one of the fundamental challenges of intimacy. And the mixtape was, for a lot of us, the first time we practiced it. Not with words, with music. With the carefully chosen voices of other people saying things we couldn't say yet ourselves. The songs were training wheels for emotional honesty. And every time someone received a tape you made and listened to it all the way through, and understood something in it that you hadn't even been able to say explicitly, that was a moment of genuine connection. Proof that the interior life you'd been so carefully guarding was not, in fact, strange or excessive or too much. That someone else could hear it and recognize it and feel less alone because of it. That's what we were doing. That's what all of it was for. There are songs I cannot hear without being immediately somewhere else. A specific kitchen, a specific drive, a specific feeling that belongs to a specific age that I will never be again. And when I trace those songs back, most of them trace back to a tape. Something someone made for me. Something I made for someone else. A 90-minute rectangle of magnetic tape that someone held in their hands and thought about and wrote a name on, and handed over with more hope and fear than they probably let on. We were so young. We had no idea what we were doing. We were figuring out who we were by trying to explain ourselves in the only language that felt true enough. Not words, songs, other people's words, other people's melodies, borrowed to carry something we didn't have our own language for yet. The mixtape wasn't a love letter. It was something more complicated than that. It was the first draft of a self, made in real time, given away. And somewhere in the giving, something got figured out that couldn't have been figured out any other way. You pressed play. The tape started, and for 45 minutes someone else knew exactly who you were. That was enough. That was everything.